I'll speak loudly. I'm known for speaking loudly. But we have Sina Toossi, Negar Mortazavi, both of you, I believe, at the Center for International Policy in one shape or form, both analysts on Iran. Negar hosts the Iran podcast. I'm just going to open with a very straightforward question for you both. Several hundred people killed in Iran. I'm guessing both of you have friends or family still in Iran. What is the reaction in Iran?
Well, it first started with the first Israeli attack. Everyone I spoke to on the ground woke up in the middle of the night in shock and horror. Ground shaking, hearing explosions, jets flying overhead. And it really came out of the blue. Nobody expected that Israeli attack to happen on that night, as U.S. and Iran had nuclear talks scheduled for just 2 days after that, last Sunday. And a sense of also confusion is what I heard from a lot of people, and not knowing what's happening, how long it's going to go for, not having so much information. The government also was caught off guard. Not so much defense, at least air defense, at least on the first day. And then we started hearing the reports of damage and all of that. And throughout the course of the past 10 days, you know, the war has escalated, as you said, over 600 killed, the health ministry just said, 5,000 injured, and many, many displaced also, with the orders of the evacuation that the Israeli army is putting out on social media, usually middle of the night. One day, Donald Trump tweeted that everyone should immediately leave Tehran. This is a city, a metropolis of 10 million people, more than the entire country of Israel. You know, women, children, elderly, disabled, where are they supposed to go in the middle of the night? I know family members, friends who tried to leave the city, had to wait in gas station lines for hours just to fill up a tank, and then drive for hours to get to towns and cities outside Tehran. And this is the lucky few who have somewhere else to go. Some are even trying to flee the country. The airspace has been closed since then, but through land borders, there's sort of a flow of people going to neighboring countries. So absolute shock and horror. I would say what it brought was, I don't want to call it a rally around the flag necessarily for the government, but a sense of unity and this opposition to an attack on the homeland, on not just the sovereignty of the country, but also on people's homes. Civilians have been killed, targeted homes, car bombs going off on the street in the name of these assassinations. And the targets were not just the nuclear program or military and political targets.
Sina, I wonder about the preparedness of the Iranian people for this attack, not just because we're reading in the papers that Donald Trump was tweeting about it and the US military were worried that he was giving away this element of surprise because he's got such a big mouth. But this has been going on for years. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has been wanting to bomb Iran since the Backstreet Boys were top of the charts, since like the mid-late 1990s. How prepared were the Iranian public for this? Has there been a sense of resignation that at some point the United States is going to bomb us?
Yeah, so Iran has been under basically US siege for over 4 decades. And this war has long been in the making. We know that the neocons who launched the Iraq war, the real goal was, you know, in the war on terror to transform the Middle East for arguably for Israel and US strategic interests to dominate the region, to regime change all these governments that don't kind of reflexively toe the US and Israeli line. And so the Iranian people in this context have been under a barrage of economic pressure. There's been an information war as well. And this is obviously a lopsided war where we just basically saw 2 nuclear weapon powers attack a non-nuclear power that they've been besieging for years. Europe also helped them a lot. So Iran was really alone. It didn't really get tangible assistance from any other parties. And so in this context, I mean, the Iranian people and this kind of rally around the country and what the national solidarity we saw was I think, something that really shook and surprised Netanyahu, that I don't think this is what he expected. I think to a large degree, they believed in their own propaganda that we're going to bomb a few spots and all it takes is another push and that people are going to pour into the streets and like topple the regime. And so that didn't happen. Iran has been a very polarized society, especially in recent years. There is definitely deep-seated discontent against the political status quo, against the government there. But at the same time, when it comes to Iran and the country itself, the national identity, its territorial integrity, that most Iranians distinguish between that, and they don't see Netanyahu or Israel or the U.S. as their savior. And so we saw this really unprecedented. I was really struck by how much the people really rallied, and there wasn't any unrest or protest or this kind of scenario that Netanyahu and them hoped for.
Liking this video? Then don't just watch, hit like, share and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism.
Negar, Sina mentioned seeing the Israelis or Americans as saviors. Every time we bomb a country in the Middle East, people pop up on American television to say, we're saving the women. This is to liberate the women. Are Iranian women being saved over the last couple of weeks?
Well, they've been killed. The woman life freedom slogan that wasn't organic. It still is movement to opposition to, the repressive internal dynamic is something that Netanyahu tried to champion back then. But I guess we're taking out the life part of it, woman freedom, but no life. Yeah, so freedom bombs coming from the sky onto people's homes, taking a civilian toll. As I said, car bombs going off on the street, attacking ambulances. Aid workers have been killed. Still the information is not very up to date and accurate. I think we're going to hear even more and more of the horror stories about it because reporting on the ground is also not as much as needed. But no, we didn't see, as Sina said, sort of that rallying against the flag that they expected. At some point, even the state TV was hacked. And this message was put out on Iranian state TV, of how bad their government is, and it's time for the people to rise up and sort of overthrow. But I guess when you're fleeing your home and your city from bombs that are falling on you, there's no point of mobilizing and sort of rioting. So, and just to add to Sina's point, yes, opposition and dissent exists in the country, as we've seen protest after protest, but it doesn't mean that this form of a foreign attack in the form of aerial bombardments is going to sort of bring freedom or better governance or democracy or a brighter future to the people. And as far as I think the sort of crack within the system is also something that maybe the Israelis had expected, and we haven't really seen that happen. Just this week, an audio was leaked by Israeli intelligence services calling Iranian top officials, asking them to put out videos against the regime and threatening their families and children. And no video surfaced, which shows that sort of that assumption that this regime is about to fall and crack, and we just need one push or a few of the freedom bombs is just going to do it. It didn't happen.
It's interesting that for 21 months, I've been on TV, radio, podcast, debating supporters of Israel saying, how dare you suggest that we would kill children in Gaza? And now we have audio of Israeli intelligence agents saying, we're going to kill your kids if you don't do as we say, which is interesting, quiet part loud. Sina, this is a country that is spoken about in some of the most Orientalist terms in the Western media. There's always a reference to bazaars and haggling and ancient civilization. There's always a reference to Khamanei when they mean Khamanei. There's a lot of ignorance and tropes, right? And it must frustrate you as someone who understands it better than most. Tell the crowd here, what are American analysts and pundits, the people they see when they switch on MSNBC or CNN or Fox? Andy called it Fox News. I refuse to call it news. But what are they missing? What do you think people here need to know that they're missing when they watch the nightly news about Iran and about Iranian policymaking, for example?
Yeah, very, very important question. Thanks for that. in general, the view that's given by the mainstream narrative about Iran or really any adversary nation is a very simplistic, black and white view that portrays things in, good or evil light, right? So Iran is demonized, Iranians are demonized, they've been demonized for decades, they're the bad guy, they're the ones who don't want peace. I mean, the reality is obviously much more complex than that. And Iran, I really view this moment still in kind of like post-colonial lens, where we really are still in the tail end of this period of European and colonization and American global dominance. And Iran was, in the past couple centuries, was like many other countries, most other countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, were subjected to, colonial conquest, interference, various machinations to take over its resources. And so you've had this period in Iranian history, not unlike Chinese history as well, like a couple centuries of humiliation, territorial loss, governments collapsing, foreign coup d'etats. And in this context, in the past century, I think what's most important for a general American public to know is that Iran has had grassroots movements for constitutional republic. And these movements started and gained ground before they even started in many European countries in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And, Iran's, for example, their constitutional revolution was eventually crushed by Russian and British interference. But so Iran has basically had this quest for more representative constitutional governance for over a century, but also more independence and coming out of this kind of colonial yoke. So I really view what's happening ultimately in the grand strategic picture as Iran, among other countries, kind of wresting their way out of this kind of period of foreign domination and Western domination. And this war, I think, is really at the root of it. It's not about the nuclear program. It's not about the weapons, the missile program in Iran, but it's that the US and Israel do not want any country, much less a strategically heavyweight country like Iran. It's a big, country with a lot of people, to kind of not be in their sphere of influence and not go along with their aims for the region, which is an expansionist Israel, consolidating a apartheid order in Israel, and kind of having this fortress Israel rule over a lot of impoverished people and chaotic kind of countries or pliant dictators. So Iran has really, been kind of in opposition to these kind of hegemonic aims, I would argue, and that is really at the root of this conflict. And it's a situation that is unsustainable, I would argue, for the U.S. to want to now go to a big war with Iran, and I think that's part of why we had the ceasefire, but we can get into that later.
Can I just add something? Yeah, to that, I agree with all of that history and big picture, but even if we look at the sort of zoom in the small picture right now, I think the coverage is such a disservice to the audiences. I mean, from day one, the Israeli strikes were, of course, by the Israelis called preemptive strikes. And the media just started repeating that. Preemptive strike has international legal connotation. It means your enemy was about to attack you, you figured it out, and you went for the attack first. And the Israelis haven't produced evidence for why this was a preemptive strike on Iran or the civilian casualty. From day one, the media refused, or at least Western, US, global media, mainstream legacy media, wouldn't cover the civilian costs of it. They would try to portray this as just a bunch of targets, very targeted nuclear sites, maybe a few scientists and military figures. But I think it's just such a disservice. And if you talk maybe not to this audience, but if you speak to an average American audience and ask them what is the one country in the Middle East that actually has nuclear weapons, a lot of them tend to say it's Iran, whereas it's Israel. So just because the Israelis have an undeclared nuclear weapons program doesn't mean it doesn't have to be reported also in the media.
There was a poll a few years ago, I always cite this one, that American public were asked in a poll, do you support the bombing of Agrabah from Aladdin? And a big chunk of Americans said, yes, bomb Agrabah, which tells you about how we deal with both geopolitics and Middle East geography in this country. Sina, talk to me about Ayatollah Khamanei. Number one, where is he? Number two, is he about to lose power? The Economist has a fascinating piece saying that the power is shifting towards a lot of the military, IRGC, who are actually way more kind of up for a fight than he is. And my third question about Khamenei is, a lot of people don't know this, but he is a religious Ayatollah, a religious leader to a lot of Shia Muslims. And he actually put out a fatwa, didn't he, about 10, 15 years ago, saying it's haram, it's forbidden to have nuclear weapons. I wonder if that fatwa is going to change after the events of the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, so it's very interesting on this issue of kind of weapons of mass destruction in Iran. Actually, going back to the 80s when Iran was a victim of chemical weapons attacks from Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the Iran war, that Iran didn't reciprocate in kind because of similar restrictions back then from Ayatollah Khamanei, who's the founder of the Islamic Republic. But Khamenei, he's, I would argue that when it comes to his approach to foreign policy, it has been pretty consistent and arguably predictable, which is maybe why things have gotten to this situation. Because he had this policy of basically using the nuclear program as a bargaining chip, you know, not going for the bomb, but also not wanting to kind of give it up entirely. Basically wanting concessions and wanting
to be a threshold state.
Yeah, to be no, but also I think, you know, what the JCPOA reflected was the great powers in America giving the Islamic Republic a higher degree of recognition and bringing this kind of revolutionary states more into the global order. And I think that recognition is something that Khamenei has wanted. You know, Iran has pursued détente with the U.S. multiple times in the 80s during the Iran-Contra, in the 90s under Hashemi Rafsanjani, under Khatami,
after the Iraq invasion in 2003.
Yeah, after the Iraq invasion, after you know, obviously during Rouhani. So I think, you know, and Khamenei had green-lighted all of this stuff. So in his vision, I think, you know, there is, you know, he wants some kind of strategic settlements with the U.S. arguably. I mean, many people wouldn't argue this, but I think the history bears this out, but not like a client-patron relationship, not like what existed under the Shah. I think, you know, because for Iran, these sanctions, the situation that has been inflicted on it is very costly, that it can't develop the way it wants to. It can't even trade with Russia and China because of U.S. secondary sanctions to the extent that it would want, or its neighboring countries. So this desire for a nuclear deal has been there. It was there with the JCPOA.
Is it still there, or does it die with him?
So that's the key question. So as you say, there's greater outcry even within the system to build the bomb, criticism that why didn't Iran build the bomb previously, that it kind of fell for this ruse of negotiations, which is unclear if Trump's negotiations were a ruse or not. But regardless, I think, you know, getting a deal is going to be much harder, and those people within Iran making an argument for giving up the nuclear program are going to have a much harder time to do that unless the U.S. is able to offer more, which I'm skeptical of, but I think it would hinge on that.
Negar, the reaction from Iran, the bombing of the airbase in Qatar, which was coordinated, we're told, with the Qataris, no Americans were killed, no Qataris were killed. Is that Iran showing restraint? Is that Iran being weak? You know, after Qasem Soleimani was killed by Trump in his first term, they fired rockets at an American airbase, gave some soldiers some head injuries, brain injuries, but didn't kill anyone. Is what we've learned in recent months that actually Iran and its quote-unquote proxies that we always hear about, Hezbollah, were much weaker than we were told? Were you surprised at the quote-unquote weakness of Iran that's being talked about? Because the Republicans are loving it.
Well, I think, yes, they are weakened, and of course, Iran has always been the underdog, but to assume they're powerless, I think, is incorrect. You know, nobody thought that Iraq and Afghanistan would take 20 years. It was supposed to be a few weeks and we're out, and, you know, the U.S. got bogged down. Essentially, in Afghanistan, returned the key back to the Taliban after 20 years and left. So, you know, to think that you can just go into someone else's country, homeland, with this strong sense of nationalism, patriotism, sovereignty, there's a central government, you know, there's a working system. Yes, there's a lot of criticism. We're both critics of a lot of the internal dynamics, political, economic, social, but to think that they're absolutely powerless and going to go away or fall with a few bombs or just 10 days of attacks, or that they can't put up a fight to defend themselves, I think it's also proven to be false. And as you said, the retaliation against the U.S. was basically Iran. They only had bad options. They didn't have any good options. Not responding would mean weakness, paper tiger, and bring more attacks. And responding to escalate could invite also more attacks. So they had to calibrate it somewhere that wouldn't cross the U.S. red line of a fatal attack, but also show or establish some deterrence.
Quick question. I want to go to the audience. Do you think Iran is now going to go for a bomb?
I don't know, but if they do, we can thank these attacks of Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump for it, because they have threatened that at least they would pull out of this international safeguard NPT system and its potential for a more clandestine underground program.
I think there was a vote in the Iranian parliament to suspend cooperation with the IAEA. Sina, do they go? Is it more likely or less likely now they go for a bomb?
I think the short-term steps, there will be several steps before that, like they might go to 90% enriched uranium, they might withdraw from the NPT, basically to increase their leverage and see what they can get diplomatically. But overall, the atmosphere is one that's pushing Iran towards a bomb.
How can they go to 90% enriched uranium when Trump destroyed all the uranium? Oh, no, he didn't. Let's take some questions from the audience. We're going to continue part 2 of this discussion with Congressman Ro Khanna shortly, but I do want to give you an opportunity to ask Negar and Sina some questions. Do we have a spare mic? Or are we using one of these mics? JP, do we know? Before we go. Hello? Hello? Okay. Should we go to the lady there in the middle? Yes. You want to stand up and the mic will come to you?
Thank you. Since we're on the topic of Iran, what would make Iran or the people in Iran hesitate in getting a nuclear weapon? It seems like, well, certainly Israel has nuclear capabilities. Also, I believe when Russia attacked Ukraine, one of the regrets is that perhaps if they had more armaments, it would have served as a deterrent. But since we are where we are right now with Iran and everything that's happened in the last 2 weeks, what would make Iran say, no, I don't want a nuclear weapon? It's hard to imagine.
Sina, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think the cost-benefit analysis for Iran and actually dashing towards a bomb has been basically the North Korea model versus this idea of getting sanctions relief, kind of including some kind of security guarantees through a UN Security Council resolution that the Obama-era nuclear deal had. Because, if Iran were to build the bomb, it would potentially also isolate it from countries that it is dealing with right now. Even China and Russia haven't wanted Iran to build the bomb. It's unclear if that may change. I think Israel's attack gives Iran more justification, both domestically and internationally, to build the bomb. But traditionally, the costs were viewed as outweighing the benefits. And I would argue, it was more of a negotiating tactic and a bargaining chip to get U.S. sanctions and international sanctions removed.
Okay, should we take some more questions? We've got time for a few more questions. Lady here in the front and then the gentleman there. Let's take 2 at a time, shall we? This lady and then the gentleman there with the beard behind.
Hello, my question is that after obviously the US got involved, Iran proceeded to bomb the US bases in Qatar. Despite Qatar being such a strong, geopolitical ally for Iran for so long, and Qatar has also said that they have the right to retaliate. Was it worth it of a decision for Iran to kind of put such relationships within the region at such stake at this point in time when Israel is not kind of caring about whatever Donald Trump is saying about the performative ceasefire? Was it worth at this point in time, despite the options being worse?
Okay, and then that gentleman there who had his hand up, you want to put your hand up again? Yes, there, right there. The United States, in my lifetime at least, only attacks weak countries. It's a 100% record of attacking weak countries for the last 40, 50 years.
And I think Iran, it would appear, became a weak country recently in the eyes of Israel and the United States. And I wonder, it's, I guess, too big a question to ask how that happened, but I'll ask instead, do you think it's seen that way by the people in charge, that they made terrible mistakes there? They let their missile defense get degraded. Their air defense get degraded. They let their missile supply, which we hear a lot about, was, I think, insufficient to scare off the Israelis and insufficiently accurate. So, and of course, they don't have a nuke. So, I mean, it connects to the last question, or 2 questions ago. But do you think it's seen that way, that this is, okay, we made terrible mistakes being weak?
It's interesting you mentioned weakness. Michael Ledeen, the neoconservative scholar, if we could call him that, who passed away recently, there's a quote attributed to him. He says, every few years, the United States should take a small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall to show the world we mean business, which is basically US foreign policy, especially under the right. Do you want to deal with that question first about weakness, and then we'll take the
Yeah, I can kind of, actually, they're kind of related. I'll give my quick, I think, when it came to this war, Iran had to go to pretty high levels of escalation. So it shot, large missile barrages towards Israel. Initially, in the first couple days, it was like 150, 100 missiles. And then it got less as the conflict kind of wore on. But interestingly, I've seen these compelling assessments that the number of hits actually went up. And I think, when it comes to measuring Iran's weakness or not, I think if this war, if it was going as well as a lot of the Israeli government's kind of claims said, or kind of the mainstream media claims, they wouldn't have ended it in 12 days. The US wouldn't have. I mean, there's a lot of footage out there of Iranian missiles hitting key sites in Israel. I actually heard from a Wall Street Journal reporter who said that he talked to Israeli officials who said that the Iranian missiles have hit key intelligence and military sites, and the Israelis are kind of reeling and they want more US support. But anyways, the Iranian approach was to drain the interceptor missiles of Israel's multi-layered air defense. It's much vaunted air defense, Iron Dome, David's Sling. And a lot of these upper altitude, very sophisticated and expensive interceptors were really running out. And this is something that the US can only make. And I read that America's production capacity for these missiles is 100 a year. So, that juxtaposed with the theater potentially in the Pacific, with the theater in Ukraine and Russia, that America can't afford to lose these in this needless war with Iran. So I think, these were among the factors that led to the ceasefire, was Iran's retaliatory capabilities, that it wasn't as weak as some of these countries historically were, that the US has gone to war. It was able to defend itself more kind of strongly. And with the question about Qatar, I think, that is like the highest rung of the escalation for Iran, where America hit Fordo and Iran was trying to signal that if America is going to enter this war, they're going to go after US bases in the region, and potentially even, these countries in the Persian Gulf will be destabilized. So yes, the reporting was that Fordo was largely evacuated, and now the intelligence assessments for today are saying that the nuclear material is intact. And there was even one report that said America gave Iran a heads up that Fordo was going to be struck. Similarly, I think Iran was very calibrated and kind of tit for tat. So Iran hit largely evacuated US bases, sent a signal to these Persian Gulf countries that their stability, is on the line. And that's, for America, that creates much greater potential costs in terms of the economic fallout globally, the Strait of Hormuz being closed. These close allies that Trump just went there and signed trillions of dollars of deals with, these are countries that rely on foreign investment. They need stability. So, there's capital flight affects them. This is why the Houthis ultimately prevailed against Saudi Arabia, because they shut down large parts of the Saudi economy for a couple of years. And, Mohammed bin Salman wanted to do this Vision 2030. So Iran, by pressuring the Persian Gulf countries as well, can ultimately, I think the calculus is, it pressures America to kind of back off.
I just want to add that Iran has been under an arms embargo for years. So one of the reasons their sort of defense or entire arms system is unconventional is because they don't have access to air defense, the fighter jets. That's one of the criticisms now. Internally, they had this deal with the Russians to purchase fighter jets, and they haven't been delivered yet. And this is exactly what you need when you're getting attacked from the sky. So Israeli jets are going into the Iranian sky, bombing, and the Iranians, essentially their defense is shooting missiles into Israel to establish deterrence. And that's why they also had this network of the axis of resistance. One reason is essentially seeing that as forward defense, as having this unconventional sort of ring of fire to establish deterrence, to be able to defend themselves unconventionally.
Let's take some more questions from the audience. Do we have questions in the back here? Anyone behind me want to ask a question? Okay, but I'm just going to check the back since they're behind me. All right, we'll go here. We'll go to the lady here.
Mehdi, I actually have a question for you. Is that allowed?
Sure.
Okay. Firstly, I'm also British American like yourself, except I'm born in Iran. My question to you is, as a media person, is a criticism, despite the fact that I love independent media. When this war started, I told all my friends and family, Iran's going to be fine. And they were like, why, Afsaneh? I was like, well, because Iran's not Syria. Why isn't Iran Syria? Because Syria, Iraq, Jordan, these nations are about 100 years old. Previously, they were part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries.
Okay.
Iran has been a consistent nation for 2,500 years. Now, the people who've lived in a place that has been consistently one nation are not going to give it up. It's not complicated. But our media, maybe it's because America is so young, it can't differentiate between who is who.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, why does the media, including the independent media, with all due respect, miss the historical and cultural narratives? Thank you.
So that's a good question. I'm not sure we've missed all those narratives. I do think we have to be careful about all these narratives. I think you're right, without a shadow of a doubt, that a lot of the borders in the Middle East are products of colonialism and the post-war settlement in a way that Iran isn't. I do worry, though, about doing, this is just my personal opinion, I don't know if these guys disagree, but I do worry about leaning the other direction too much, which is essentializing people and saying, well, they're one civilization, they're one nation stretching back centuries. Then you get into this kind of, if you remember when Barack Obama was president, and he was asked about the Sunni-Shia split, and he said, these are ancient hatreds. And I worry that that's also an Orientalist trope as well. When you talk about people, like America is a young country, but for example, when we talk about Emmanuel Macron being a useless president of France, or when we talk about French foreign policy being hypocritical, we don't also talk about Napoleon's role in that, right? So I don't think we should always just rush to long historical judgments. At the same time, I think history is vitally important. For me, the fact that Iran is an ancient civilization is actually less relevant than the fact that in 1953, there was an elected prime minister of Iran, and he was toppled by a CIA coup, and then the Shah came back, and then the Ayatollahs came in, and none of that is taught in American schools or American media. And then we say, we start the world in Palestine on October the 7th. We start the world in Iran in 1979. That, for me, is a bigger problem when it comes to history. And I do think context is important. And if you are subscribers to Ziteo, you'll know that we focus a lot on context and history and not starting the clock yesterday afternoon. We got time, I think, for a couple more questions very quickly. A lady here stood up very enthusiastically, and lady here has been waiting as well in the top. We'll go to these two.
Thank you. Thanks for this wonderful discussion. Knowing what we've seen, like in Iraq, Libya, and all this, the fake reasoning of regime change and all of that, we know that if it's profitable, it's going to happen. So just from your combined experience, realistically, what do you think will happen? Yes, what is the best case scenario? And what is your vibe say? I know sometimes our president just does things based on a vibe. So what is your best case scenario?
Best case scenario.
And how likely is it?
Do you want to pass the mic over this way? So lady here, raise your hand so we don't, yep.
Thank you. First of all, thanks guys so much for your time today. I actually have two questions. The first one is the timing of the strikes on Iran. I just read today in the Washington Post that Israel had been planning for a year for these attacks. Do you think, in your view, that it came coincidentally when the Syrian regime fell back in December, when Assad's regime fell? Do you think Syria's regional, Syria's domestic and regional dynamics have anything to do with that?
Who wants to take on the WMD question and the Syria question?
I can talk about that. Well, yeah, I've been on mainstream media a lot this past 10 days, and absolutely, I hear the narrative not just from the host, but the other guests. Usually I have to debate someone who's pro-war, pro-attacks, and it's very much a similar debate. These were nuclear weapons program or bombs, or that we have to stop them from imminently building the bomb and the nuclear program, or again, the preemptive strike that the Israelis have been framing their attack as. Yes, very much, I think, sort of reminds that era in the discourse of the pre-Iraq war. As far as the timing of the Israeli attack, I think the Israelis had been planning for something for years, and Benjamin Netanyahu has been trying to push the U.S. into a war with Iran for over 2 decades. But this also, I think this attack was aimed at sabotaging U.S.-Iran diplomacy. So a round of talks were scheduled for Sunday in Oman between Tehran and Washington. As this attack came just before that, and the talks were off. So he's been trying to sabotage diplomacy under Obama, the past few months under Trump, and I think they just saw their chance, maybe got a green light or a yellow light from the White House, and they just went for it.
Isn't it amazing that Netanyahu tried to get Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George Bush, Dick Cheney to bomb Iran, and he got the guy from Home Alone 2 to do it for him? Think about what a world we live in. Sina, best case scenario.
Yeah. So best case scenario, which I think could be connected to this narrative that the timing was largely because of these ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations. So, Netanyahu and Israel, their opposition to the nuclear deal under Obama, or their opposition to U.S.-Iran diplomacy, is really rooted in they don't want America to come to terms with Iran and kind of disengage from the region, and where they need America as their main backer to give them unconditional support, because they have all these expansionist projects. They want to take over West Bank, Gaza. So they basically need America in the region. They need this foe in Iran, which it's very interesting, how they pivoted to demonizing Iran in the 1990s, when actually Israel gave covert support to Iran in the 80s during the Iran-Iraq war. It's a very fascinating history. But so this, in terms of the best case scenario, so, there's 2 schools of thought right now. So one is that, Trump, these negotiations with Iran were kind of a ruse. He was playing like 4D chess, strategic misdirection, meanwhile green-lighted Israel to attack. The other one is that, no, he was adamant about a deal to the extent that he's coherent. They were pursuing it. Steve Witkoff had 5 rounds of negotiations, and the attack happens a couple days before the scheduled talks last Sunday in Oman, which many people thought was they were going to reach some kind of initial interim deal or kind of principles agreement. So if this latter scenario is true, which I'm inclined to think that, because I don't think Trump and them are capable of playing this kind of big 4D chess, that Trump, Netanyahu kind of steamrolled him, said, hey, you gave him 60 days, it's day 61. We got this amazing plan. We're going to take out their military leadership. We're going to help you get a deal. That's how they sold it to him. The initial day on Thursday or Friday, when Israel took out all those people, and it seemed like deactivated or through cyber attacks or whatnot, a lot of Iran's missile forces and air defenses were kind of paralyzed for a couple hours. That Trump came out, said it was excellent. He wants to look tough. This is great. This is good. But then he was silent for 2 days after the missiles, Iran's retaliations came. And then as it became evident that this was going to be a quagmire, it seems like, and now this is bearing out, that he was looking for a face-saving way out. He hit this, it seems like somewhat symbolic strike on the Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran retaliated against Qatar and this U.S. base in Qatar. And Trump announced a ceasefire. And this morning he was like, cussing out Netanyahu. And so in the best case scenario, which it's good to be optimistic, I could envision a potential scenario where this really showed the limits of a military action against Iran. They did it. None of the strategic aims Netanyahu or America wanted were achieved. Iran's nuclear program is still intact. Its ballistic missile program is intact. The regime is still there. Iran hit back hard. It showed that it can hit back hard. The cost would be immense. And so in this context of America wanting to pivot to Asia, Russia, Canada and Panama, I don't know, all these pressing, these other priorities Trump has in his domestic agenda, that in this optimistic scenario, that Trump, having seen Netanyahu play to him, with this new right-wing backlash against Israel, there is a path to, in renewed negotiations, again, what that looks like, what Iran would want. Again, it's an optimistic scenario, but that would be the worst case scenario for Netanyahu.
Please give it up for Negar Mortazavi and Sina Toossi. Thank you for the analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Did you like this video?